tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I will tell you, no one is cheering for Justin Trudeau in Washington, D.C. this week, where the NATO summit is convening, and Canada has nowhere to hide for its refusal to increase its defense spending to 2% of its GDP. This is the commitment that NATO allies have made. It's something that the U.S. has always had to bear a disproportionate share of. But we're seeing now a tremendous amount of criticism that I've not recalled from recent years, even when that number that Canada is spending has been low, from Americans. This is a clip from Mike Johnson, who's the U.S. Speaker of the House.
Shamefully, Canada announced in the last few days or last couple of days that they won't be ponying up. They're not going to do their 2%. Why? Well, talk about riding on America's coattails. They have the safety and security of being on our border and not having to worry about that. I think that's shameful. I think if you're going to be a member nation and participant, you need to do your part. Some have a greater sense of urgency about that, clearly.
I wanted to discuss this and related aspects with former Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, retired Vice-Admiral Mark Norman, who it's a pleasure to have on the show. Admiral, thank you for coming on. Good to speak to you.
Well, good afternoon, Andrew, to you and your viewers, and thanks for taking a serious interest in this really important topic.
For people that have not been as familiar with this discussion over the years, and I'll be clear, this is not a discussion that just began with Justin Trudeau. It's longstanding. Where does that 2% number come from, and why has it been determined to matter to NATO allies?
Yeah, so without dragging your viewers through the decades-long history of NATO, basically, during the height of the Cold War, everybody was seized with the urgency and need, and it was a smaller community. And then, as NATO evolved, the member nations grew with the collapse of the former Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera. We find ourselves in about the last decade or so as NATO was transitioning out of its enormous contribution to Afghanistan and looking into an unknown future. It was becoming obvious that there was an enormous discrepancy across the member nations with respect to defense spending, and this was agreed roughly a decade ago, in fact, under Prime Minister Harper initially, that this was the right metric to define sort of a fair and reasonable playing field, if you will, for defense contributions, recognizing, of course, that there were some incredibly small and relatively poor nations, and there were some large and relatively wealthy nations, and that, across the board, this was a good way of measuring contribution in a way which was commensurate with your relative wealth and your capacity to pay. And so that's kind of the background that got us to the last couple of years, and then we can discuss where the wheels have come off the wagon, to put it bluntly.
And just on that note, I mean, there are some countries that are, incredibly disproportionate in what they're providing. The United States being a notable example. They're up, I think, at about 3.5% of their GDP. I think Poland is somewhere near 4%, if I recall correctly, or has been. But spending money, there isn't really a guideline for how you're spending it. I alluded to this earlier. I mean, the government could just, hire, a bajillion consultants and, say, great, we've spent this much on defense. It doesn't mean they're providing something better than other countries. So has that actually been an issue where you have countries that are spending money, but they're not really getting anything for it?
Yeah. So, yeah, and I heard your comments earlier, and I think you hit on a valid point. So, there's sort of two perspectives on this. One, ultimately, as taxpayers' money here, it needs to be responsible use of those funds. I will add that in the last few years, a number of things which were previously not included in Canada's calculation have been included, including support to veterans, Coast Guard, those kinds of things. So, in theory, those should make us look better, but it speaks to the gravity of the problem across the board that that there is a significant underspend here in Canada. But the other part of it is that, it's a bit of an imperfect metric. And, I've spoken previously about the fact that it is not an ideal metric, but it is the agreed metric. And, to your point, NATO doesn't care how you spend the money. They want you to spend the money efficiently. And ultimately, the taxpayers of Canada should insist that the money be spent responsibly and efficiently. But the reality is that in the Canadian context, there are so many things which are grossly underfunded that we could and should hit the 2% target. One of the concerns I have is that our internal mechanisms and processes are so dysfunctional for a variety of reasons that it would really be difficult to spend that money efficiently, responsibly in the period of time that our allies are looking for us to spend. So I'm not making excuses for
Hmm.
anybody, but this has been a problem that's been decades in the making. It has become an acute problem in the last several years for obvious reasons, and we can't spend our way out of this just by throwing money at it. But that's what they want us to do. But you know what? There is a legitimate shopping list of things that are required that are not currently funded. So that's kind of my circular reaction.
Well, and you obviously came up through the Navy in terms of your service to the Canadian Armed Forces, and as I understand it, that's always been one of the most just notoriously underfunded aspects of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah, well, all the elements of the armed forces have their own problems, and yes, to your point, one of the challenges with the Navy tends to be what we describe as the most capital intensive. Everything it's big, it's shiny, it's very expensive to buy, it's very expensive to operate. You need very sophisticated facilities to support it. And but it's a relatively small from a people perspective. The Army is kind of the opposite. It doesn't mean it's not a high tech organization because it is, but it tends not to have the magnitude of equipment. And then the Air Force is kind of in the middle, where the fleets all need to be modern, and the staffing needs to be appropriate. So. And what we've got at the moment is we've got a bit of a perfect storm playing out here. The chronic underfunding of the last couple of decades, in the last few years in particular, means that the capital fleets that should have been replaced, and by fleets I mean everything from trucks to destroyers, need to be replaced. They're long overdue. That's causing enormous problems in terms of maintaining the current capabilities, which are in many cases, if they're not obsolete, they're rusted out, and then that has an impact on morale, because a lot of people, if they are inclined to join, don't want to join to operate equipment that's older than them. And the people that are in and have been in for decades are growing increasingly frustrated with the fact that they can't do what they know they need to do on behalf of Canadians because they don't have the support, both in terms of material support, i.e., funding, and you know what? There's a significant lack of what I would call moral support, particularly with this government, who, although they're
Hmm.
saying the right things, I'm not convinced they actually believe that this is important. And I think this is part of the reason why this 2% issue has been such a problem for them, because I really don't think they believe in the need for strong defense. They play along, they say the right things, they've got all the right slogans, but deep down in their core, I don't think they genuinely think it's that important. And ultimately, all of the things that Canadians love and enjoy and are struggling with on a day-to-day basis, from economics to everything else, are all premised on a secure environment.
Hmm.
And that goes beyond our borders. Um, the reason why the issue in Ukraine is so troubling is because it's representative of a far bigger problem with respect to a clash, not just of political ideology, but a clash of geopolitical political systems. And if we want to continue to um, try and rebuild the kind of Canada that we all love, we can't let other external forces determine what kind of global systems we're going to operate under.
I wanted to go back to that clip I played earlier of Speaker Johnson in the U.S. accusing Canada, he said the word shamefully, of riding on the U.S. Military's coattails and the U.S. government's coattails on defense. Because, I mean, the Canadian and American armed forces have long-standing ties and connections. NORAD, one of the most, I'd say, incredible success stories in the world, not just in North America. That attitude, is that reflective of an attitude that exists in the U.S. military itself, or is that just an attitude in the US political class? Because I know you would have had a number of dealings over the years with your counterparts in the United States. And I'm curious if that's just a political posture or if that's something that was a very real sentiment from the Americans.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. So let me preface my comments by saying to you that historically, and I speak from a historical perspective because I'm no longer serving, but traditionally throughout my career, there was there was a heartfelt, genuine acknowledgement of the caliber of Canadians, be they at sea, in the air, or on the battlefield. And it was enormous respect. And it was kind of one of these things. We love you, Canadians. We just wish there were more of you.
Hmm.
Was the sentiment, and more, not just in terms of the numbers of people themselves, but more armed forces, in essence. And uh, I genuinely believe that that is the undertone. I know that on a individual peer for peer basis, that level of respect is still there. However, I also know that in the last couple of years, in particular, for a variety of reasons, including what I would describe as the relative, if not absence, let's just say, the infrequency or lack of depth of Canada's presence around the world, has caused a number of allies to start questioning our commitment, not the competency of the individual, but our commitment. And then there's also been some issues with respect to some of the recent experiments around dress, deportment, and appearance, which have caused some of our allies to kind of shake their heads and ask what the hell we're thinking. But that level of um, concern, I believe, is entirely, it's transitional, it's episodic, and I believe that there's a substance there. The bigger concern is exactly what you characterized, which is at the political and national level. And there's a, notwithstanding the politics of this in the current um, time frame, there's also a bit of a societal issue here. We have enjoyed um, living under the umbrella of the United States for decades. We have enjoyed an incredible degree, at least until recently, of national prosperity, and all of these have, allowed us to kind of invest in ourselves, if you want to put it that way, as opposed to looking at our responsibilities more continentally first, and then globally as it relates to defense and security.
Is your sense, and this is, I guess, getting outside of your military experience and more to your think tank and analytical roles that you have now, do you think that the public calculation on this changed with Russia invading Ukraine? Because all of a sudden you have a type of war that had seemed very abstract and very anachronistic for basically 80 years that's now happening in Europe. And I don't know if that sentiment has necessarily translated to North America. Certainly, colleagues of mine I know in Sweden and Estonia, it's very real for them. And I think that for Canadians, I'm wondering if you think that has changed anything at all, or if the idea of needing to have defense, the idea of needing to protect against a war is still just a very abstract concept for people.
So I think the needle has moved, but I don't think it's moved significantly. So the good news is that I genuinely believe, and certainly polling has shown, that there is a heightened sense of awareness and concern, and whether that's translating into a belief or a commitment that more needs to be done. Um, I, the polling would say yes. I'm not really sure. There's a couple of challenges with this. One of them is what you just alluded to in your question, is that and the speaker kind of joked. Well, he didn't joke about it, but there's a saying: the farther you are from the sound of the guns, the less the stuff matters. So if you're in Latvia or Estonia, and by the way, we have a battle group. Canada has a battle group in Latvia, and then this is a very real problem for you. This is not a theoretical issue. This is real. And the same goes for, Sweden and Finland, who, by the way, for your viewers, are the latest joiners in NATO in the last few months. It's a huge step
Mhm.
forward. Um, but when you're far away and you're living under the umbrella of the most powerful nation on the planet, and you've lived for maybe a few years, or certainly like some of us for our entire adult lives, in a system whereby you never really had to worry about it because you just assumed that it was all going to be looked after. It has created a sense of apathy. So there's a fair bit of inertia associated with that apathy. But the reality is that the global security situation is incredibly troubling. And yes, I mean, we've talked about Ukraine. We haven't talked about China. We haven't talked about the real genuine concerns about the growth of China's military, and its expansionist philosophies and behaviors. And I said this the other day in another conversation. Do I believe that somebody in the next few years is actually going to invade the territory of Canada? It's possible, but I don't think it's very likely. But there's the problem. If that's the limit of somebody's willingness to accept or understand the scale of the problem, then you can't have the kind of conversation we have to have. This is about our way of life. This is about how our economies function internationally. This is about trade. This is about all those things that we hold near and dear. This is about our freedoms. This is about the rule of law. This is about all these things. And China and Russia and other um, mal actors are looking to reset a system that they have watched, observed, and bluntly not liked for the better part of the 20th and 21st centuries. And they want to reset the rules of the game. Um, Now, if people want to live under those new rules, okay, fine. But this is why this is such a big problem for our peers, our allies, and those like-minded nations that we like to, cuddle up to and befriend. But we're we're not showing them that we actually care. Um, we might say we do, but what they're looking for is, okay, come on, Canada, take your own defense seriously, and that goes back to your question about how you spend the money.
Mhm.
Um, the, Everybody talks about Article 5 and NATO and the all for one and one for all kind of philosophy here. Everybody forgets about Article 4, which basically says you will do everything you can to defend yourself. And if something happens and you can't, then we will come to your aid under Article 5. So where's Canada on Article 4?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're being reminded of, is our obligations, because we're not doing everything we can and everything
Yeah.
we should to look after our own territorial integrity, and more importantly, um, our ability to do what we need to do um, in the continent in cooperation with the United
Yeah.
States.
It's the old airplane safety announcement of put your own mask on before you help your neighbor. If you can't protect yourself and aren't protecting yourself, you certainly don't have anything left to help anything else. So, the fascinating discussion. So many other areas we could go with it. I hope we can get you back on, Admiral Mark Norman, retired vice admiral and also fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. It's been a pleasure, sir. Thank you for your
Thank
service and
you.
for your time.
Thank you, Andrew, to you and your viewers. And you know where to find me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.